Welcome guys, Mr. Hyatt here. This is part 3 of the APES Chapter 9 lecture on agriculture and pesticide use. So we left off of our last lecture talking about disadvantages of synthetic pesticide use. Here we're picking up with the laws that regulate pesticide usage. You see there are several overlapping, which is good. We want as many eyes on something that's this potentially dangerous as possible. But like everything else, has to be funded, has to be enforced. And that's difficult. It's really difficult to regulate what goes on an individual farm. That takes a lot of administration, that takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of just people in trucks driving around monitoring what's going on, and it takes a lot of, honestly, it takes a lot of citizen activism. It takes, if you see something that's not right, it's kind of like the government's advice. If you see something, say something. That certainly happens around here. A farmer breaks the law and a neighbor reports it, and then there are consequences. So what can we do? How can we reduce our pesticide use and not lose all those advantages? Because they did do some really great things. We can rotate crops, that helps. So if we adjust our planting time, if we stagger it, we don't plant the same time every year, or if we don't plant all of our fields at the exact same time, both of those are going to basically starve out the pests and allow enemies to eat them. Polyculture is going to provide home for pests' enemies. There are some plants that you can companion plant. They're going to attract things that eat pests for another plant. That's something that absolutely can happen in a backyard garden even. You can implant genetic resistance through GMOs. You can use natural enemies. You could physically bring in a predator of the pest to eliminate those. But then you're kind of getting into there's a story that I read as a kid called Ricky Tikki Tavi where they were trying to get rid of something, so they brought in snakes, and then the snakes overpopulated, so they brought in something else, and so they just continually had to keep bringing in predators. That's not always an ideal answer. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can also use pheromones, which are hormones that are outside the body. And those pheromones, if you've ever seen ants marching in a trail that's really like a serpentine trail, really circuitous, they're following pheromones to get to whatever they're trying to follow the leader to get to. So you can manipulate those and lure pests into traps. And you can also attract natural enemies into crop fields. You don't have to physically go buy them and bring them into the fields. Other ideas, you could disrupt their hormones. Using insect perfume and hormone alteration are both time-consuming and costly. And if they get into the water, our hormones are very similar to their hormones, so you can really get into some pretty serious issues. And we've seen some of those in recent history here in the U.S. If we reduce synthetic herbicide usage to control weeds, that helps. Integrated pest management is going to be using combined tools to control pests. So again, like I said, I can't remember which video this was. I think it was the last video. Integrated pest management is doing a little bit of everything and not a lot of anything. So you're going to bring in some natural pests. You're going to companion plant. You're going to do a polyculture. You're going to rotate your crops. And you're probably going to use a little bit of synthetic pesticide. All of those things cumulatively don't have a huge impact on the environment. Individually they don't have a huge impact on the environment. Cumulatively they do. They're reducing your pests. So what are our sustainable solutions for producing food? Because we got to have it. We got to be more efficient with our resource use. We got to find a way to circumvent the harmful effects of industrialized ag, and we got to eliminate those subsidies that make unhealthy food really affordable. We need to conserve soil. So both classes looked at terracing, both classes looked at contour and strip cropping. I've talked about my personal experience with planting cover crops that thankfully just went in this weekend. The last of it went down. And you can set up windbreaks to reduce wind erosion. You could even use something like alley cropping and agroforestry to provide that windbreak. So you're doing two things at once. You can use organic fertilizer, so just use animal or green manure, which is kind of like compost, to restore soil fertility. So again, it's natural, it's organic, it's not a synthetic chemical. Reduce irrigation dependence, set up your land better, dig furrows to move water around in your farm ground, things along those lines. Rotating crops, of course, switching to salt-tolerant varieties if you do have irrigation that has salinated your soil. Our crops themselves can be more sustainable. So we can do organic ag and polyculture. We can use more renewable energy for agriculture. So use one of my favorite farms near my home. They all of their farm stuff, their outbuildings and all that kind of stuff, is powered by a water wheel. They have traditional electricity in their home, but all their farm stuff is all powered by an old school water wheel. It looks like it's from like the 1500s. But that's tough. The transition that I'm trying to make right now in my personal farm is tough because it's expensive. I have to be trained. I have to know a lot. Definitely the international funding doesn't affect me, but it's just time consuming and it's effort consuming. So to do this on a larger scale, we would have to provide funding for poor countries because this whole process is more expensive. Those subsidies that are currently existing to subsidize things like beans and corn should go away, and we should subsidize things that are easier to harvest and are better at meeting our nutritional needs, and that way we can feed more people. And then, of course, we need to better educate consumers because, as you guys have seen already, things don't necessarily mean what you think they mean in terms of the food you eat and the way that it's produced. How can our meat be more sustainable? Well, we need to eat less of it, first of all. There's a really cool program called Meatless Monday that I would encourage you all to look at. That's ultimately what has to happen. We have to reduce our need for meat. So we have to switch to more of a plant-based diet. We can free-range chicken and use manure for fertilizer. Truly free-range chicken, not just make it fit the rules. Use more grain-efficient forms of animal protein, like poultry. Poultry they internalize most of their protein, so the grain that they pick up for sure gets turned into protein. They're not excreting it as waste. Plant-eating farmed fish are the same way. And then, like I said before, eliminate or reduce our consumption of meat. Fish and shellfish, how can they be more sustainable? These two councils certify fisheries and fish farms, aquaculture facilities. They certify them as being sustainable, as being good stewards of their environment. We can use open ocean aquaculture, which is just kind of starting to take off, where we have a fish farm out in the middle of the ocean. We just have to go out there to retrieve it. Of course, we're going to have carbon emissions when we go to retrieve it, but it's better than the farm being right next to the coast where they're exposed to more higher levels of PCBs and things like that. And it gives us an option to farm different varieties. So again, it helps us increase our biodiversity, and definitely the biodiversity that we're sustaining. We can use zero discharge freshwater ponds and tanks. That's going to protect coastlines because often what we see is these ponds and tanks, well, they're going to fill up with feces and excrement. And so a zero discharge plant is going to use that fertilizer. They're going to think of the aquaponics stuff that we looked at earlier in this unit. Things like that reduce the impact on coastlines, because if we aren't using the fertilizer, then we're just going to pump it out somewhere, and the water is going to carry it eventually to a coastline. Things like that are definitely going to lead to dead zones and things like that, like we see in the Gulf of Mexico today. We can make better choices, buy sustainable fish, reduce your fish print, eat less fish, find your protein from plants. And then we can do polyaquaculture, where we're growing communities of fish instead of just a whole bunch of tilapia together. We can grow many fish together, again, to increase that biodiversity, and we reduce the impacts of each individual fish. So that's the end of chapter 9. See you soon.